Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our Philippines week, our second Philippines week. And this may prove to be one of the most important shows we do in this series because we've talked about the resistance, we've talked about the Allied units, but we haven't talked about the darker side. Just when we cover France, we talk about the resistance, but we have to talk about collaboration and Vichy. The same applies to other countries. So joining me today is Maria Felisa Tan to talk about the various paramilitary collaborators and informers in the Philippines. So good afternoon, Maria. How are you today?
I'm fine. Good afternoon to those in the UK and in France, and good evening to those in for our Metro Manila viewers.
Brilliant. So, how do you define yourself as a historian? We have people who come on the channel. Some are very much about the battles and military. Some people consider themselves anthropologists or cultural historians. How do you treat yourself?
Okay, I specialize in the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, but more on the darker side, on the atrocities, because my first book was on the Kempei Tai, or the military police uh, of the Japanese in the Philippines. And this one is about of the darker side too, with regard to the collaborators uh, who caused much of the suffering of most of their fellow Filipinos.
Hmm.
Then also, you can also call me maybe a contemporary historian because I've written books on the post-war period, focusing mainly on the presidencies from Manuel Rojas and lately up to Fidel Ramos. So I'm planning to go on writing about the next president after Fidel Ramos. So that is my ongoing project.
Okay, thank you. And my next question, before we bring up your PowerPoint, is we've talked with Desiree and Ronnie and Ricardo, the other guests we've had, about how it's becoming harder as the years pass to create an interest in World War II, younger people in the Philippines. Is it even harder when you're talking about the darker side, the collaboration, to kind of get people to be interested?
Well, in general, you have to explain to them first what are some terms. For instance, uh, my lawyer does not know even what Kempei Tai means, so I have to explain. And then, for instance, they don't know what Makapili is. So at this time and age, even my daughter, my 27-year-old daughter, does not know what the Makapili is until, she saw my book. And I told her about it. I have to tell stories about it to people because, more than 75 years after the war ended, no one is it's so difficult to make people interested. And so I praise Desiree because she has these tours going on in Intramuros, informing the young, bringing students there, telling them what happened, and that I think that picks up their interest. And also when I used to teach in the university, I also used to, try to show films to my students, bring them on tours so that, they will have an interest, at least in this part of history.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, we brought up your PowerPoint. I'm going to hand it over to you to take us through this. And folks, the links to the purchasing the book are in the description below, as they always are. But I'm going to hand over to my guest to talk about this darker side of World War II in the Philippines. So over to you.
Okay. Okay, so let me give you a brief background of the types of collaborators, Filipino collaborators, during the Japanese occupation. So just a brief explanation. So first, we have the political collaborators. These are the top government officials who served in the Japanese-sponsored government in the Philippines, like for instance, Jose P. Laurel, Claro M. Lecto, and so on. So much has been written about these political collaborators. And so we go next to the economic collaborators. These are Filipinos who amassed wealth during the Japanese occupation by the buy and sell business of supplying the Japanese war materials. And it's interesting to note that the son of former President Sergio Osmeña was an economic collaborator. Okay, and then we go to the cultural collaborators. These are people actually who help the Japanese in their propaganda. They're usually employed in writing articles in newspapers and magazines promoting the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere of the Japanese. And so now we go, this is the point or the focus of my discussion, would be the paramilitary collaborators. They're somewhere between the police and the military. And most of them, of course, are not professional soldiers, although there are also some professional soldiers uh, in these groups. They're either formed by Filipinos or by the Japanese themselves. And lastly, we have the informers. I don't think we have enough time to talk about them, but they don't belong to any paramilitary group. But they're hired by the Kempei Tai, and most of the Japanese use them to point out the suspects or the guerrillas who are anti-Japanese. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and start. Okay, let's take one paramilitary group. So the first one is the Bureau of Constabulary. It was formed under the Department of Interior, but actually it was controlled by the Department of Peace and Order under the Japanese. Okay, so who is this guy? He's the director of the Bureau of Constabulary. He is a professional soldier, a member of the USAFE, and later on, you will know. I will tell you about his trial and how he was the only professional military soldier who was tried by the collaboration court. Okay, let me give you some examples of notorious BC or constabulary members. So let's start with Francisco Sebastian. Uh, his alias was Pugot. Pugot in Tagalog or in English means to cut off the head. Okay. Uh, he was stationed in Papayan, Nueva Ecija in Luzon. And what he did was, he would go hunt out the guerrillas. And maybe if these people were not even guerrillas, if he just suspected them, he would, cut off their heads and bring them back to the Japanese. No questions asked, no interrogations. So he was that cruel. Then we go to Manuel Hernandez. Uh, what struck me about him was also, again, his cruelty. There was one suspect who was investigated by the Japanese for being a guerrilla. And what the Japanese did was they bayoneted him, and so there was a wound there. Now, this Manuel Hernandez made it worse for the victim because he thrust his bayonet on the same wound that the Japanese made on the suspect, screwing his bayonet on the wound, so much so that the person could not anymore take it and he instantly died. Okay. Erasto Batong Malaki. Okay, he was a very ardent collaborator of the Japanese. He was the head of the Bureau of Constabulary in Davao. And in fact, it is even said that he made the blood compact with Japanese by the name of Major Matsusaki. And Matsusaki, in return for his cooperation, would even give him his special samurai sword as a token of appreciation for his cooperation with the Japanese. And because of Batong Malake, so many guerrilla suspects were investigated, tortured, and killed because of his efforts to bring them to the Japanese. Okay, let's go to the next group. We call them the Ganap. If you literally translate Ganap in English, it would mean complete or fulfilled. Actually, this was a group that was originally part of the Sakdal movement or the Sakdal group. Let me just give you a brief background of the Sakdal group. The Sakdal group was founded by Benigno Ramos. So you have his picture here. He's the leader of the pre-war Sakdal movement. He was a well-known poet, writer, and orator from Bulacan. So before the war years, he was ardently asking for immediate independence. And of course, our Commonwealth government still had to wait for 10 more years because of the Tidings-McDuffie Act,
Hmm.
which was passed by the US government, giving 10 more years. But he was against it. And so he formed the political party, also known as Sakdal. He had a newspaper called Sakdal. Sakdal meaning to oppress or to accuse in English. And later on, there was this group of peasants under him who would put up uprisings during the Commonwealth period. And when that happened, Ramos would flee to Japan. And eventually, he would think or believe that Japan was the savior of the Philippines. And so he would go back just before the start of the war, but President Quezon imprisoned him. And later on, he would rename his Sakdal group to Ganap. So many of the Ganap members came from the Sakdal group of Benigno Ramos. And later on, when the Japanese came to the Philippines, they would release Ramos from prison, and Ramos would tell his Ganap members to cooperate actively with the Japanese, which of course many of them did. And the group was active, of course, in Luzon. Okay, let me give you an examples of notorious Ganaps. One is Emilio Bartolome. He is from Muñoz, Nueva Ecija, and he was even appointed as mayor by the Japanese. So he was not only a Ganap, he was also the mayor of the town. Uh, the Ganaps in that province would call him Silitzitayis, uh, maybe because they would, call him that because maybe the people were afraid of him, and he would implement a reign of terror in that area, and he burned the homes of those who disobeyed him, killed guerrillas, took control of the rice mills. And of course, the Japanese later on realized that, he cannot be retained as mayor. He was more cruel than the Japanese. And so they find him too aggressive and removed him as mayor.
And just to jump in for a second, we did the show with James Zobel a couple of nights ago, and we heard
Okay.
extensively about Japanese cruelty, the hell ships and the POW camps. If they're removing someone because he's cool by their standards, I mean that's insane. I mean, this guy must have been absolutely barbaric.
Yes, I think so. Can you imagine burning the rice, taking control of the rice mills, burning the homes? And, usually the others would just, bring them to the Japanese, torture them. But this one did more than that,
Wow.
this guy.
And just, I mean, maybe you're going to be covering this later on, but is there a common theme amongst them of motivation amongst these individuals? Is it power? Is it a genuine wish to be they hate the Allies, they prefer the Japanese? Is it about control, money, wealth? Or is it too many
Actually,
different
there,
factors?
there are many factors. One is they really like the Japanese.
Yeah.
They believe that the Japanese would do better than the Americans. Many of them believe that. Secondly, of course, for food, for money, because they would get some kind of compensation, some of these members. So there were several factors, and this I think would be some of the factors why they collaborate. Some, of course, would be threatened by the Japanese and forced to collaborate. Like there were some constabulary members uh, who were part of the Death March, and after that, when they were imprisoned in Capas Tarlac, before they were released, there was a condition. The condition was that they should join the constabulary. And so I think some of them were just threatened by the Japanese. But when I examined the court records, very few would give that reason, and more would give reasons because they really believe in the Japanese more
Okay.
than the Americans.
Thank you.
Okay, now we go to the famous Makapili. So if you say Makapili, it's actually more like a generic term. And if you look at this picture here, many people say that all those who wore this native bag over their heads with slit eyes would be called the Makapili. But that's not true. Not all of those who would be wearing this would be Makapilis. They could either be a ganap, a constabulary member, or even a Japanese. Okay? But anyway, most of the ganaps who were former sakdals were incorporated into the Makapili later on because this was a little bit formed a little bit later. Okay, the word Makapili means Kalipunan ng mga Pilipino, or translated in English as League of Patriotic Filipinos. And they were often mistaken for the so-called Taong Bayong, which I already said here, those who would wear native bags over their heads, but not all were Makapilis. And they were founded on November 10, 1944 by the Japanese. And the group was even inaugurated on December 8, 1944. So the founding members, and really there were prominent ones. They were prominent members here, like Pio Duran, Aurelio Alvero, Leon Villafuerte, Jose Baluyot, Pablo Capa, and Antonio Belisario. So let's take one of the members. Okay, Pio Duran, he's the Director General of the Makapili. He is a lawyer, a businessman, and an educator. So he was that prominent. And even before the war, he even wrote a book which praised the Japanese. And he said that all those criticisms that the Americans were making about the Japanese was just propaganda on the part of the Americans. So it's the other way around. And he believed in the naval power of the Japanese and said that the Philippines can look forward always to the help of the Japanese rather than the Americans. So even before the war, he was openly pro-Japanese. And so were the other members that I mentioned, like Aurelio Alvero. He was just like Pio Duran, a prominent businessman who would also believe in the Japanese more than the Americans.
Crazy.
Okay. These are examples of notorious Makapilis. One is a big group composed of 80 members. They call themselves the Borong Borong Makapilis. And they were named after their leader, Agaton Martin, alias Borong Borong, and active also in Rizal province. So all of these groups I've been discussing so far are in Luzon. And then we have Galiciano Villanueva from Santo Tomas, Batangas, and Chodoro Barameda from Lipa, Batangas. Okay, I selected these two because actually out of the thousands of cases of paramilitary collaborators, these two were the only ones sentenced to death by the Supreme Court and by the People's Court. And it was unfortunate for them that they did not live to avail of the executive clemency of President Quirino, which I will explain later. But these two are no different from the others because uh, they were also not as barbaric as the one as I told you earlier,
Hmm.
but they participated in the raids of the Japanese, caught guerrilla suspects and all, and even in massacres. But I don't know why they were singled out. There were, others whom I think should have also gotten the death penalty. But, out of 1,000, only two of them were given the death sentence and it was, implemented. Okay, this is just a picture of the Borong Borong Makapilis when they were put on trial before the collaboration court. Sorry, but it's not so clear because I had to get this from an old newspaper.
No, we can understand. We can see it.
Okay, question? You can see it.
No, no. I'm just saying we can see
Okay.
it clearly. It's good. No, and thank you for this information. I'm writing down questions to ask you later on as well.
Okay. So let's move to the Visayas area. What I've been discussing so far were groups in the Luzon areas. So here in the Visayas, you also had similar groups. For instance, you have the Coastal Defense Corps, formed in Iloilo, and they wore uniforms of the Japanese soldiers. And then you have the Standing Army, formed in Negros Occidental, headed by a certain Captain Yamaguchi. So again, just like the ones in Luzon, they were either formed by Filipinos or by the Japanese themselves. Then you have the Loyal Blood Party. You find them in Cadiz, Negros Occidental, and it's headed by a certain Sergeant Say. Okay, so I don't want to be repetitious, but they're just like their counterparts in Luzon. Okay, then we have in Mindanao, also some groups formed. One is the Tetuan Volunteer Guards. You can find them then in Zamboanga City, and it's first headed by Roman Miguel and later by Bruno Soriano. Okay, so these are Filipinos. Then you have the Kaijun Jutai, again also in Zamboanga City, and they were attached to the Japanese naval headquarters, okay, and rather than to the Japanese military. They're sponsored by the Japanese, but it was created by Miguel Moreno. So I'll explain later who Miguel Moreno was. Moreno was a Spanish mestizo, but a Filipino citizen by birth. The members of this group always they were armed. They had a uniform consisting of blue denim shirt and pants with olive green cap. Okay, and an anchor also. Okay, let's go to Miguel Moreno. I single him out because he was as brutal as the one that I discussed earlier. He's an ex-convict at the San Ramon Penal Colony before the war. And during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese gave him absolute control of the penal colony. He was known to everyone as the terror of Zamboanga. In fact, he was responsible for the massacre of the Otto Gale. Otto Gale was a German-born Filipino citizen living in Mindanao, and his family at Patalon Coconut Plantation in Zamboanga. One day, Miguel Moreno just came with his men, and while the Otto Gale family was inside the house, they would just shoot incessantly at the house, of course, killing all the members who were there inside. Okay, now let's go to the issue of wartime collaboration. I think it was given to the Filipinos to decide about collaboration. I don't think many of them would not find it a problem for the political collaborators. But then, we needed rehabilitation funds then, and the United States, through the Secretary of Interior Harold Ikes, threatened President Osmeña with no rehabilitation funds if collaborators were not punished by the Commonwealth government. Okay, we were still a semi-independent, uh, country under the United States. Okay, so how did they define treason? Collaboration. Collaboration was equated with the crime of treason, and it was cited in Article 114 of the Revised Penal Code of the Philippines. A People's Court and an Office of Special Prosecutors was formed on September 25, 1945. The court had 5 divisions that could hold sessions in Manila and other provinces in the Philippines. So all in all, there were 5 divisions formed, and for every division, there were 3 judges who formed part of the court. So usually, the first 4 divisions held sessions in Manila, while the last one, the 5th division, held sessions in the Visayas. Now, the budget allotted to the court in the beginning was 1 million to 1.4 million pesos. That would be reduced later on to a much lower rate. And there were only 24 to 25 prosecutors for over more than 1,000 collaboration cases. So the money was too little, and you had more than 5,000, more or less 5,600 collaboration cases all in all. and you only had 24 to 25 prosecutors with a very limited budget. So that was already a problem.
So just a question for you on that subject, because I was going to ask it later on, but it's come up now. So when the Canadian historian Tim Cook talks about the lack of Canadian kind of enthusiasm for prosecuting war criminals at the end of the war, because everybody was just, in a sense, fed up with death. There'd been enough killing and suffering, and Europe was in ruins, and Asia is in ruins. These is the same thing happening in Philippines. The people who are watching this show, they've read James M. Scott's book Rampage about what was happening in Manila in 1945. I mean, the Philippines had seen death, suffering, and devastation on a biblical scale. Was that amount of death in environment part of the lack of interest in pursuing collaborators? People just wanted to kind of put it behind them, or was it something else?
Well, it's like this. It depends on the kind of collaborator.
Right.
If it's the paramilitary collaborator or the informer, most Filipinos really wanted to have what you call retributive justice.
Right.
They wanted them to be punished because there was a case of collaborators in the Visayas. These were paramilitary collaborators, members of the constabulary in Cebu province. You know, when they were just being brought to the court, people were already stoning them and shouting at them. And, you know, the guards had to protect them because people just wanted to kill them right then and there. So you can just see, you know, the outrage of most Filipinos for these paramilitary collaborators. They wanted them really to get to be punished. But then I will discuss later on some problems why only two were, you know, sentenced to death, and why were they were the only ones singled out. It was quite a puzzle for me at the time when I was researching.
Okay, well, I'll let you explain, and I'll do some more questions at the end.
Okay. Okay, let me just give you some pictures. You know, there's some examples of the judges. Actually, the judges were supposed to have been screened before they were appointed to the People's Court. They should not, first of all, have any position in the wartime government. So these were judges, lawyers before the war. One is Leopoldo Rovira. So this is Fortunato Borromeo, Manuel Calleja, and Tiborcio Consinco. These are just examples of the judges. Okay. So the trials for the collaborators started as soon as the People's Court was formed. But then President Rojas, who took over President Osmeña, right after the republic was formed, decided to issue an amnesty proclamation on January 28, 1948, for the first three set of collaborators. So political, economic, and cultural, they were all covered by the amnesty proclamation. And, you know, that's done. But then, of course, even after the war, there was a sort of stigma already for being branded as a collaborator. And I could give you an example like the son of President Osmeña, Sergio Osmeña Jr., who was an economic collaborator. When he tried to run for the presidency around, I think, the 60s or 70s, people were still branding him as a collaborator. Okay, and then for the paramilitary collaborators and informers, not included in the Rojas amnesty, they continued to be tried by the People's Court until the latter's abolition on June 19, 1948. After this, all the cases were transferred to the respective courts of first instance. And cases could be appealed to the Supreme Court always, especially if it's the death sentence imposed. Okay, so let me give you some pre-trial problems. One, most of the collaborators resorted to this uh, postponement of trials, and they kept asking for reinvestigation. Okay, and then these are the other problems. There was a lack of gasoline, transportation, and lack of travel expenses for witnesses because some of them came for the far-flung provinces in Luzon, and if they had to go to Manila, they had to pay for their transportation. This was not provided for by the court. So evidently, most of them just gave up being a witness. Then the credibility of some witnesses. It is funny because in the trial of Guillermo Francisco, this witnesses already signed affidavits claiming about the claiming that Guillermo Francisco was a collaborator. But then when they were questioned again by the prosecutors of the People's Court and they were shown their signatures, they would say, "Oh, is this my signature? I don't recognize it." Or that my signature my signature just looks like a bit like this, maybe somebody copied it. And so, they just gave up testifying. And then the forgive and forget witnesses. Many would, won't go to the trouble of going to the courts and then paying for their own transportation. So they said, oh, that's forgive and forget. Then you have the threatened witnesses. Okay, I can cite the case of an informer, a woman who was a mistress of the Japanese, who kept pointing guerrillas to the Japanese in Intramuros, and then because of her, many of these guerrillas were killed by the Japanese. Now, when her trial came, there were two witnesses who actually saw her do that, pointing guerrillas, and then the witness was supposed to be brought to the People's Court, but then she had connections. And her lawyer then was former President Diosdado Macapagal, who was just a lawyer at that time, an attorney. They brought the witness to him, and there was still, I think the woman also had some relatives who sort of, forced the witness to sign an affidavit that retracting her testimony earlier about this collaborator. But then she told her problem later on to the prosecutor, who went on with the trial later on. But this is just an example of a threatened witness. Then the prolonged detention of some collaborators. Because of lack of prosecutors and the number of cases, most of the collaborators were detained in prison for a very, very long time. And they kept complaining when, and they kept waiting when their cases would be finally tried, either by the People's Court or the courts of first instance. Then, the refusal of some witnesses to sign sworn statements. They said, okay, I will testify, but I will not sign. So that's another problem. Then the personal revenge of some witnesses. Okay, so maybe a witness had the grudge against this so-called collaborator, and then eventually they would find out that that person was not really a collaborator, but that this person who testified against him just wanted revenge. So there were some cases like that. Okay, let's go to the trials. There were many death sentences imposed by the People's Court on the paramilitary collaborators and informers. But the Supreme Court usually reversed these death sentences and lowered it to reclusion perpetua. Just to make it clear, reclusion perpetua does not mean life imprisonment. Reclusion perpetua is a sentence at least of 30 years in prison with an accessory penalty. So don't equate it with life imprisonment. Okay. For instance, Miguel Moreno was given the death sentence by the People's Court. But when he appealed his case to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court decided to just reduce his sentence to reclusion perpetua. And Moreno was claiming that he helped President Rojas in the past get released, I think, from the Japanese. So he was claiming that. Maybe they believed him, and so his sentence was just reduced to reclusion perpetua. And as I said, only two Makapilis were sentenced to death by the Supreme Court. In the case of Teodoro Barameda, the court of first instance which tried him sentenced him to reclusion perpetua. But then when his case was brought to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court decided, the Supreme Court decided to change his sentence to death. They said that, he massacred a lot of Filipinos, but I don't see the difference. With some, collaborators, they singled him out and he was sentenced to death and the death sentence was implemented. Galiciano Villanueva, he was given the death sentence by both the People's Court and the Supreme Court. Okay, so only these two Makapilis. They're actually poor Makapilis living in Batangas. And if you want to know what happened to Pio Duran, he was, of course, tried as a paramilitary collaborator. And then his case was brought after the People's Court was abolished. His case was brought to the Court of First Instance of Manila. But there are no records about, what they did with this case. Or he was released on bail. Nothing is said about him. I can't find his records. Okay, and on July 4, 1953, an executive clemency was given by President Elpidio Quirino on the paramilitary collaborators and informers. And this was the same executive clemency given to the remaining Japanese war criminals in the Philippines. So together with them, the paramilitary collaborators and informers were also given amnesty. Okay, so that's the end of my talk.
Well, brilliant. And I've got questions. So
okay.
We've got a few questions from viewers, but I'm going to start first. And my kind of general, I've got a lot to unpack here. So I'm living in France as I do. The collaboration and resistance is so complicated because, and you talked about that, and they've got questions from others watching this, is that if I was living in France, for example, but I hadn't been an active collaborator, but I've still been part of the mechanism, maybe I was still doing what the occupiers told me, and down the road is someone who's actively been working for the occupiers. So they've been, earning proper money, and they've been informing, and they've been doing things like that. Would I be prepared to go out and speak against that person? Because it would cause me to question my own lack of defiance to the occupation. I mean, because everybody in an occupied country is part of the occupation to some extent. Unless you're actively in the hills, going out and in the resistance, you are under the occupation. So is that kind of part of it? People they're questioning their own war and how they reacted to the occupation.
You mean here in the Philippines?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just using France to compare it there. In the Philippines, people who are there, who are just getting on with their lives. People, if you're living in Manila, for example, you're a Filipino businessman and you've been forced to do stuff, but you haven't been a collaborator as such, but you've not been defying it. Would that make it complicated to speak out against?
Yes, that's the case of the political collaborators. They were not really doing anything, but they were part, of the system, and so they were branded as collaborators. But I think the people cared more about those who really brutally treated them, like these paramilitary collaborators, not so much about these political collaborators or economic collaborators, or even more so the cultural collaborators.
Okay, thank you. So this is
But
a question.
I think.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, I think in France, the Vichy government was harsh on the collaborators, if I'm right.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. So we've got another question from Tim here. So he's saying, and this is just a basic fact for some of us who don't understand the Philippines: did the Japanese replace civil government officials like mayors and judges, or were they kept in place like in Vichy?
In this case, of course, they wanted, of course, President Quezon and Osmeña, but both of them fled before the Japanese came. So those who were left behind were forced to serve the Japanese. So they were placed there by the Japanese members of the Quezon government.
Okay, thanks. And this is one from Rick Green here. So Rick is asking, we're talking about some of the particular parts of the Philippines. Is there an anti-Muslim motivation on the part of the collaborators in Mindanao?
Uh, I don't think so. There was not an anti-Muslim motivation. Uh, I think they really wanted to collaborate. And by the way, there were some Muslims who also collaborated with the Japanese. Part of the Tetuan volunteer guards, there was a certain man by the name of Arula. He was a Muslim and he cooperated with the Japanese.
Okay, thank you. Our next question from David Levine here is asking, he popped in a bit late, were economic and financial incentives important among collaborators? So, were you offered cash to betray your country?
Oh, yes. For some, especially the poor ones who were going hungry and needed, something to eat, at least, to support their families. Yes, it was important.
Okay, and a similar question from Trent Telenko. To what extent did the Japanese use control of food supplies to get collaboration? In that, if you're hungry, it's much easier to get people to work for you if you're struggling to feed the family. So was that? I think that came up in the show with Des about the food shortages. So is that a factor?
Yes, that's a big factor because usually the food was rationed out. But for these people who collaborated, they were given, support, as I said, money and food.
Brilliant. And then one from Scott Grimwood here, and it's obviously you talked about the lack of people sent to trial, the lack of actual justice imposed on those people, but there are also going to be people who were known to be collaborators who are still living among the people for years and decades after that. So he's asking, how were collaborators treated in general by Filipinos after war? Is it kind of come into that kind of forgive and forget, or is it more complex?
For most Filipinos who knew them as collaborators, it was a stigma. And most of these collaborators would not even define themselves, they wouldn't talk about the war. So let me give you an example. We had a family driver then who lived through the war. And, I tried to interview him about his activities during the war. He didn't want to talk about it. And then I learned later on that he was a member of the Makapili group.
Mm.
He was hiding it.
I mean, it's complicated. I mean, one of the things that's come up on this channel before about not about the Philippines particularly is the words resistance and collaboration are heavily loaded. When you think resistance, you think actively going out and blowing up enemy train installations, and and collaboration is that the worst end is actually taking money to betray people and as you said yourself, going out and massacring and torturing people. That's the worst level of collaboration. But in the middle are just those people who are trying to just exist. They're trying to survive. They're trying to feed their family. They're trying to kind of bend with the breeze and hope for a better future without necessarily aligning themselves to either the Japanese or the Americans. And those people, I think, in all occupied countries, they're the ones that it's harder to understand. I mean, when I get asked as a Brit living in France, what's it like living under the German occupation? I go, well, you have to ask a French person, really, because I can't explain the complexities. So, as a Filipino yourself, it obviously is complicated understanding in cities like Manila or across Luzon and what have you. When you're struggling to feed your family, it does bring into question where your loyalties are. So it's a complicated subject, is what I'm saying.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Because
brilliant stuff.
I read some cases of some Filipinos who did not really torture any suspect. They tried as much as possible to avoid doing that. Okay, they were just trying to exist, just to live off the food given by the Japanese. But then, when the Japanese found out that they were not doing what they wanted to, and they themselves would be killed by the Japanese. So it's a hard thing to do, trying to pretend, quote unquote, that you're collaborating, but at the same time, you really don't want to.
Mm.
and you just want, you want to be there just for the food rations.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's that middle area that's comic. So Desiree's making a comment that guerrilla justice was better than our courts. Many traitors were killed by the guerrillas. So that kind of
Yes,
field
yes, that's true.
justice ending up
Yes.
being more successful.
Yes. They took it in their own hands, and even before the Americans came, they killed most of the Makapilis and all of those they knew who were active collaborators.
Okay, and then this is the next question is Tone brought it up earlier about the motivation because and the lack of interest in persecution after war. He's saying life in post-war Philippines was tough, plus smothering legal bureaucracy, so tended to forgive and forget and move on. Prosecution traded off for resiliency. So he's making that point about how tough life was. And then there's independence to look forward to as well a few years later. So is there maybe a sense of looking forward to the future than looking back at the past in that immediate post-war period?
Mm, Maybe not for all, but I think there were still a lot of those Filipinos who wanted justice, retributive justice, which was not given by the court because there were some judges also in the court. I forgot to say this. There were some who believed that this collaborator should not be tried. For instance, a justice by the name of Eusebio Lopez. Every time a case fell onto him, he kept saying that the sovereignty of the Philippines was suspended during the war years. And so for him, there was no active collaborator. We were just forced into that situation. And it made it so difficult for his other justices to come up with a final decision on the case of a certain collaborator.
Mm. And I think that before we bring things to an end, I really want to kind of finish with saying that this is a very small percentage of Filipinos, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about a country with a population of millions back then and even more
Yes,
now. I mean,
yes,
we're not talking about widespread collaboration. It is mercifully and thankfully for your country, it is quite small. What
yes.
this is the kind of tough question, but it goes back to the idea about motivation. But why did not more people sign up for this? I mean, when the Japanese are there, when you're seeing Japanese aircraft flying over daily, and you're aware in 41 and 42 just how dominant the Japanese empire is, and America seems a long way away, the Commonwealth seems a long way away. What was it? This sort of just sense of inner strength the Philippine people have that many more didn't succumb to collaboration.
Uh, Many, I think, believed in the Americans still. Many were pro-Americans. And when the Japanese came, their actuations were not good. They would slap people, they would not bow at them. They imposed all these strict laws, pretended to give independence. And so, the Filipinos were not fooled by what the Japanese did. So I think it's more of, comparing the Japanese with the Americans. Uh, Many preferred the Americans. My father was a survivor of the Death March, and he would honor MacArthur. He even had a big bust of MacArthur in his room and saying, "Oh, he's our hero, General Douglas MacArthur." uh, you know all of them, most of them would really be very pro-American.
Hmm. So before we bring things in, my last question is anything else you think you'd like to say about this while you've got this time now that you haven't said or read anything about the general situation that you haven't already said?
Well, I think I've said everything. It's just that uh sad to say, the justice system here in the Philippines has not changed. It's still the same as before. Those who had connections with the higher ups would usually be pardoned. And those poor Filipinos who had no connections would usually be the ones who would be given the harsher sentences. It's just the same. It has not changed.
Well, I think that is unfortunately the case for a lot of the countries at the end of the war. Is the more power people had, the less likely they were to be brought to justice. The lower you were with the least resources, the more likely you are to be. I mean, we're going into a separate subject, but the poor French women whose heads were shaved brutally in the streets and in the Netherlands and Belgium for maybe just smiling at a German soldier once were treated far worse than the actual people at the top of the organization making millions out of the occupiers. They tended to get away with it, and the lowly folk were those that were punished. But that's a depressing point to end on. But thank you for joining us. It's been an incredibly informative show, and I'm glad we have spent some time acknowledging this darker side, because it's balance. It's all about looking at the Philippines from different points of view, and you've helped shed a light on this darker side. So thank you very much.
Thank you too.
So, folks, we'll be back again on Saturday. Francis Neri is talking about the Filipino Air Force, and I'm back tonight with an impromptu show to talk about the future of World War II TV and Patreon funding. So, thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you all later. This is Paul Wood for World War II TV, and saying enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everybody.